A few months ago, I discussed the Conjuring Trilogy of horror movies, all three of which I hold very dearly. However, I was aware that, when I made that video, I had opened up the floodgates to the rest of the Conjuring Universe and would eventually need to review the remaining entries in the franchise. And while I've talked about and admonished the two Nun spin-off films, what really caught my attention was the trilogy of movies based off the cursed Annabelle doll from the cold open of the first Conjuring film. That scene effectively introduced us to the Warrens, but I suppose it was also meant to function as the setup for a broader connected universe of films, which was kicked off in 2014 with a movie simply titled Annabelle. So I suppose that's the best place to start. Without further ado, let's take a look at what may very well be the least talked about entry in this major franchise, even though it was a huge box office success. The movie starts out in a pretty underwhelming fashion, merely replaying the majority of the opening from the first Conjuring movie, and then jumping into a very cheap-feeling first set of scenes within a church. The characters are immediately pretty generic, the music is a lot less fitting and well-made compared to The Conjuring, and it's got a really strange feeling to it. This movie just doesn't feel like it's a professional production at all, and that trend continues throughout the entire duration, but we'll get to that in due time. Unlike this movie's pacing. To be fair, the first few dialogue scenes do have a few funny one-liners.
Children are a blessing.
Indeed they are. And then they learn to talk.
Which make it feel more down to earth. However, we're also treated to some truly terrible dialogue scenes minutes later between the husband and wife main characters. These characters are incredibly uninteresting, and the way that they already have a big argument and fight so early into the film feels quite jarring. Such dramatic elements feel like they're being introduced far more prematurely in order to rush through the character setup and jump into the horror, which clearly shows its diminished efficacy in comparison to the slow, methodical setup of The Conjuring. But beyond that, this scene, as well as pretty much all of the other dialogue in the movie, is lazily written, drowsily delivered, and has a ridiculous context behind it. The fact that the wife is mad because her husband said that having a baby would be difficult is just laughable. Like, really? What's he supposed to say? That introducing a screaming, crying, expensive little monster that shits all over the place and makes you clean it up is gonna make life a piece of cake? But to be clear, I understand that having somewhat generic main characters isn't the end of days. In fact, the first Conjuring's family was very basic, but the difference is that in that movie we had the Warrens as very likable and interesting protagonists that we could root for. This movie has nothing of the sort. There is this lady who's introduced later who owns a bookstore, and I actually like her quite a bit. She's charismatic, strong, and is by far the best part of the movie, but she's not in it all that much until the end. For the most part, we're stuck with this husband, who's only interesting because he's somehow an overworked man in the 60s who doesn't beat his wife, which is like finding a fucking unicorn, and his insane, unhinged, and terribly acted wife, who has a giant doll collection. I'm sorry, but am I supposed to think it's normal for a grown-ass woman to have a massive doll collection that her husband even acknowledges will make them short on rent if she keeps adding to it? Because I don't think so, and if it weren't for this, the whole movie wouldn't happen. But once we actually get to the horror, things get slightly better. The way that it starts out with a pretty disturbing sequence of two cult members killing their neighbors and then breaking into their house and stabbing the pregnant wife is really interesting, and this shot of the neighbor's house in particular is really great. I like that it's kind of like a home invasion movie here, but soon enough, it just gets stupid as shit. So apparently one of the cultists was their neighbor's estranged missing daughter Annabelle, who then kills herself while holding the wife's newest doll and somehow possesses it by bleeding on it. What? They later confirmed that they went to the neighborhood to kill her parents and then summoned something, which apparently they did via the doll. So you're telling me that these motherfuckers scoped out the house next to her parents and then found a doll they liked because that was the best way to summon a demonic spirit? That makes no sense whatsoever. And this is all without even mentioning how terrible the technical aspects of the movie are. The camera movements are all very strange and make the movie feel like it was filmed on an iPhone, and the music just feels unfinished and dissonant. Although I suppose that's because the movie only had a $6 million budget rather than $20 million like The Conjuring, but I don't think that's an excuse since there have been much better made and better looking horror movies that are far cheaper. The mother is put on bed rest after this assault, and the following scene of her distractedly using a sewing machine makes good use of suspense, but it feels very awkward when the needle actually pricks her, and the way a fire then breaks out so fucking quickly after just a bag of popcorn exploded is bizarre. A lot of scenes in this movie feel like they're just from some ridiculous daytime soap opera, but this movie takes itself so seriously, which makes it really unenjoyable. For example, when the husband comes to see the wife after the fire, it's revealed that the baby just came out. Like, what? This movie somehow manages to be super fucking boring, but also never pumps the damn brakes when it actually needs to. Due to the fire, the couple moves to a new apartment, and it's at this point that the movie really starts to suck Cybertron's subterranean saber. Every scene is just the same shit over and over again, having something slightly creepy happen only for her to be saved whenever her husband or anyone else comes to the house, or just whenever she snaps out of it. Like, what's the point other than to extend the runtime? And the mother being an unlikable character who acts like a Martian really becomes noticeable, as certain scenes, like when she interacts with these kids, feel like they were written by... Well, I was gonna say AI, but this movie's too old for that joke, so I'll just say it was written by someone dumb enough to think that AI writing movies is a good thing, cause that's even more of an insult. The movie attempts to have messaging about overcoming trauma and fear, instead prioritizing strength, and it also has a great opportunity to utilize its housewife protagonist to comment on the gender norms of the time, but it fails to really accomplish anything other than shoving out obtuse lines. The way they represent these supposed themes of overcoming trauma is just by literally having the characters say they need to overcome their trauma 10 times. Not a very good plan. At least the movie rightfully uses the sound of a baby screaming and crying for a horror scene because it's one of the most bone-chilling sounds there is, but the ensuing part of her being grabbed by a demon's hand is so predictable and looks so cheap that it made me laugh rather than jump. Again, the horror scenes may occasionally have decent ideas like an elevator that keeps bringing her back to the same floor, but they all end up having no consequences, being ruined by some dumbass editing or effect, or just making no sense at all. Not only is the movie boring as shit and not scary, but it's not even visually presentable and has very little to enjoy. It's not so bad it's good, it's just so bad it's bad. There are a few unintentionally hilarious and head-scratching moments, such as when they drop the lifeless Annabelle doll on the floor and expect it to scare you, or this ungodly line,
"You know I can't stand this."
I'll bring your sewing bag in later on. Okay, we can turn the whole room into your own little sweatshop.
But it doesn't save the movie from flopping in the same lifeless fashion as the doll in the scene I just mentioned. We already know the doll is haunted so early on, meaning every scene just reiterates the same bullshit with no real purpose until we finally slog into the finale, which is actually the highlight of the movie. The lady from the bookstore gives an actually emotional and moving monologue about her dead daughter. There's a creepy scene where music is played backward on the record, which is 1,000 times more effective than any of the music in the actual score of the film, and this jump scare is actually really fucking creepy. It made me jump. Not to mention the fake out moment where she smashes the doll and then thinks it's her baby is really damn good, and I honestly wish it was real, because making this a movie about a mother who just goes insane and having this be the twist ending would be exponentially better than what we actually get. The ending is kinda confusing and underwhelming. The lady from the bookstore sacrificing herself to save the couple and their baby would be very impactful, but it fails to elicit any reaction from me other than confusion. I don't get how a sacrifice really solves the issue. If the demon wants the blood of the living to become more powerful, then wouldn't it just never leave the family alone until they all kill themselves and offer their souls? It doesn't make sense for it to just fuck off when one person sacrifices themselves. While the ending 15 to 20 minutes sometimes work and have some highlights, the overall movie is a total mess with awful writing, lame characters, abysmal pacing, and very awkward, badly done attempts at horror. It will forever stand in the shadow of the Conjuring movies that preceded and succeeded it, and though the finale saves it from being the worst movie in this franchise, it's still a horrendous 1.5 out of 5. Also, is it just me, or is it weird for the priest to insist on taking a picture of the mom and her kid all of a sudden? Is this a prequel to The Conjuring, or Spotlight? 3 years after a bizarre and failed first attempt at expanding the Conjuring Universe, they released a sequel, or, well, a prequel, to the original Annabelle, this time centering around a group of orphans who are housed in the home of the original Annabelle doll and its creator. The film immediately demonstrates heightened production values with many interesting, memorable shots of doll pieces strewn about, and additionally, the much-improved music lends the film some legitimacy that its predecessor was sorely lacking. And the first few scenes after that do a great job of introducing us to this family, as well as making them out to be far more human with better writing and acting that makes us sympathize with them more. In general, the movie looks a lot better, with more interesting varied locations and an effective old-timey feel. Although most of it is contained within this house and its surroundings, it doesn't get nearly as stale as the first film did, and it has some standout set pieces for sure. One of the early highlights, though, is undoubtedly this bit on the open dirt road where the family's car breaks down, and while the father tries to fix it, this happens.
I'll get it!
That was actually a pretty great shocking moment that surprised me and was a far more effective cold open than the lazy recycling of old footage that the last movie used. After this, we're introduced to the actual main characters of the film, and though I feel like there are maybe too many of them to fit into this singular movie, it never feels too obtuse, as it's incredibly clear which ones are more important and which are mere side characters. They make up for this slight overcrowding with the great acting and solid writing of these characters though, in particular with our protagonists, a little girl who's been struck by polio named Janice, and her sister. They immediately have really good and believable performances considering their young age, and we grow to get really involved in the terror they face. This movie also does a better job of pacing itself with a more slow, subtle build-up. I think it's a bit too long at some points, actually, as the horror scenes don't influence the actual plot until around 50 minutes in, which leads to a jarring disconnect, but there are some highlights in this slower first half. I love this tracking shot introducing us to the layout of the house, and they do a great job of effectively and naturally setting up various objects and areas that will eventually be used in horror scenes. Like, when you see a dumbwaiter in a horror movie, you just know it's gonna become important later. Even among these fake-out scares in the earlier scenes, there are some really solid moments, such as this sheet slowly walking toward Janice as she's backed into a corner, or this jump scare following a long and spooky scene of two girls joking around under a bedsheet. The movie also manages to create a solid atmosphere even this early on, as the couple who own the house and lost their daughter in the opening are very mysterious and lend themselves to exaggerated stories by the girls. It's a classic tradition that's been in the horror genre and broader media for as long as anyone can remember, making up such urban legends. From Boo Radley to the Myers house in Halloween, the myth of Jason being told around countless campfires, and everything in between, this is a great choice that I think makes the movie feel a lot more creepy. And this blink and you'll miss it Nun cameo is also really cool and honestly more unsettling than both of the actual Nun movies combined, if you ask me. Once things really kick off after close to an hour, though, the movie does maintain many of its strengths, even though I actually might prefer the slower first half in hindsight. The back half may be more exciting, but it's also a bit messier. It starts off right with this sequence of Janice being attacked by a freaky demon girl in the hidden doll room and then being forced up the stairs against her will by a stair lift. This kind of stuff is actually very intense, as we feel just as helpless as the character, transported back into those vulnerable senses of naive childhood fear, meaning this movie brings back one of the best aspects from the first two Conjuring movies. And this jump scare of her being thrown into the air is a brilliant use of a misdirect, using the blank space on the right side of the screen to draw our eyes over there, then shocking us by putting the action in a totally unexpected area, similar to the wardrobe scare in the first Conjuring. There are quite a few other great parts throughout the final act here, from the terrifying imagery of the father's hands being bent and broken as he holds a cross and his wife's dismembered corpse being crucified, to this extended, perfectly suspenseful sequence in an old shed with a slowly animating scarecrow. More subtle and emotional moments are here too, such as when Janice tells her sister that she'll be adopted into a great family, trying to be happy for her while simultaneously feeling that she'll be abandoned due to her injuries and illness. It's heartbreaking and perfectly delivered by the two young actresses.
No matter what happens, nothing can erase all of those things we did together.
There are, however, some really weak and kind of dumb scenes too, such as when she's thrown into this farmhouse and possessed. It's definitely a necessary part of the movie, but the way that her screams all the way up until when she gets possessed are somehow silent to all the other characters, and they only hear her once the important plot moment has taken place, is stupid and contrived. Also, this well jump scare is, well, terrible. It's so predictable, and the little girl is so dumb for standing there like that. But it's salvaged, as I've already mentioned, by the far more numerous good moments, including when the demon throws the nun against a mirror, as it subverts our expectations that she'll have a showdown with the demon, instead leaving the sister to her own devices for a little bit. The finale is really good overall. I just wish there was a bit more of a struggle when they finally defeat the doll, because as it stands, they basically just throw it into a room and it's all okay. I understand that the room held it previously without issue, but a bit more conflict and spectacle would have made this a lot less underwhelming. At least the movie does a much better job explaining the mythology, just saying that the doll was a conduit for evil which is cleansed from the house by the blessing of a priest, though still leaving an opening by having Janice run away, disappear, and take the identity of the dead daughter who possessed the doll. This is then used to tie it back into the first Annabelle movie, as she's then adopted by the neighbor couple from that film. This makes the entire plot point of her returning for the doll from that movie make way more sense, even though it's still convoluted and very dumb that the doll just so happened to end up in the hands of the couple directly next to her adopted parents. I appreciate them trying though, as it just shows how much better this movie is. I mean, it's such an improvement that it even retroactively fixes some shit from the last one. This movie isn't all good, and it does drag on at some points, leading me to believe that a 1 hour and 50 minute runtime was a bit overkill, but it's an effective horror movie that's solidly made and has some good moments. 3.5 out of 5. I also like how they show us the neighbor's perspective from that home invasion scene for the first time, but I don't really get the recast of the cultists. Like, is that Mikey Day and Maureen Ponderosa? Sorry guys, but I don't think that's very scary. But finally, the story of this trilogy ends with 2019's Annabelle Comes Home, which is the only one I vividly remember the release of. I remember seeing constant commercials advertising it, not to mention Annabelle's creepy-ass face plastered all over the walls of the theater whenever I went to see a new movie. But now that I've finally seen this movie, rather than just all the advertising hype around it, does it end this rather messy trilogy off on a high note, or will it descend back into the depths from whence the Annabelle franchise originally came? Well, the first 10 minutes are incredibly promising, primarily because Ed and Lorraine Warren are in it. Yes, the ones from the Conjuring movies. This had me really excited and hoping that the movie would essentially be a fourth Conjuring movie, this time centered around Annabelle. And to be honest, I think that makes perfect sense. Annabelle was always kind of the crown jewel of the Warrens' collection after all, that's why she was behind that glass cage. So a Conjuring movie showing how truly powerful her evil could be sounds like a fantastic idea to me. But unfortunately, that's not what this movie is whatsoever. There are some pretty good creepy moments with Annabelle and the Warrens at the very start, but then they just put her in that cage and all seems well. I do appreciate the reintroduction of the text crawl and the ominous logo accompanied by that scary-ass music though. That's just the perfect way to start these movies off, if you ask me. However, you may be wondering, if this movie isn't about the Warrens, then who do we follow throughout the movie? Well, the Warrens' daughter. Now, even though I was initially disappointed that Ed and Lorraine were just gone on vacation and left the movie until the very end, I do really like the idea of exploring their daughter more as a character because that's, in my opinion, one of the most practical areas to expand upon in this universe. The parts with her and the doll in the first Conjuring were pretty great, so I totally get why they went with this approach, and the plotline they introduce about the daughter seeing things just like her mother Lorraine does is a step in the right direction. But what really made me enjoy the first part of this movie is a lot more subtle but a lot more important. The characters are great and the atmosphere is fantastic. This suburban fall 70s atmosphere with teenage babysitter characters and younger children reminds me a ton of the Halloween movies, particularly 1 and 4, and that's always a good sign. All the actors here in this young cast do a great job, and this is undoubtedly the best set of characters in the Conjuring universe outside of the actual Conjuring Trilogy. Not to mention, the movie is also charming and quite funny.
Bob, Mrs. Faley went ahead and dropped a can of tomato sauce in aisle 5, and it looks like a crime scene, so get them up.
5 minutes later.
There's been an accident.
I think the best example of the characters working so well here isn't the daughter or her babysitter, even if they're nice and likable protagonists, but rather the babysitter's friend Daniela, who's a far more complex character. She essentially causes the entire conflict of the film by snooping around the house and taking Annabelle out of the cage for a moment. Now, I originally thought this would end up just being a typical played-out story of an overly curious and idiotic character causing everyone else pain because they can't just let things be, but they make a very interesting move here that bolstered my confidence in this film's story pretty solidly. They essentially redeem this character by giving her the motivation of wishing to speak to her dead father, who died in a car accident while she was driving. This makes her immediately sympathetic and a lot more nuanced rather than just a hateable, one-dimensional villain. Although I still don't fully forgive her actions, because she let the damn cakes burn! So the movie basically becomes a similar affair to that of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark or the Goosebumps movies, where a bunch of kids and teens have to fight back against the threatening evil force. It's not very original, but I like those movies, goddammit, and I like this one too. In terms of horror, it likewise doesn't do anything unique, but just sticks to tried and true methods to create a fun experience, and what more am I really supposed to want from this kind of movie? And there are some great moments here, from this one that feels like a reference to The Strangers.
Can Annabelle come out to play?
I think you have the wrong house. There's no Annabelle here.
Is Tamara here?
No, you got the wrong house.
To this great panorama shot that's reminiscent of The Conjuring 2, and this awesome scene with a turning colored light wheel that leads into a solid jump scare. The movie may focus on atmosphere, characters, and setting for a long time, but when it does get into the horror, there are some truly memorable highlights, such as this other jump scare that isn't just startling, It's downright disturbing. Okay, if I am to be more critical for a moment, I do feel like this movie's plot is very bare bones and feels disjointed considering how long we go without even seeing certain characters at all, such as this Bob guy or even Daniela, but at least it does excel in many other ways. And the finale, like a lot of the second act, has some good moments and is overall well done, but also has a few jarring issues, like how Bob literally disappears for 20 minutes and the scenes he does have are completely inconsequential padding. I also do feel like it's all a bit too much going on at once near the end though, as the sudden inclusion of this soul-sucking demon feels super abrupt and all kinds of shit is attacking the characters from every angle. It's really overwhelming. You can tell they tried to resolve the issue I had with the last movie where they beat Annabelle way too easily once they just got her into the right room, this time trying to inject a lot more difficulty for the characters and making it more dramatic, which I appreciate, but I also think they really overcorrected and ended up making a messy though enjoyable final confrontation with some solid moments. At least at the end, we're treated to some really sweet character moments such as the daughter's birthday party or this conversation between Lorraine and Daniela.
All the evil in here reminds me of all the good that's out there.
And it all ends with a loving tribute to the Warrens, who passed the same year the film came out. I think they can rest easy knowing that this one is a keeper. Even if it's sometimes convoluted and messy and other times has too little going on, it usually finds the perfect middle ground, and with great characters and an immersive setting to boot, it's a strong 4 out of 5. Hey everybody, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then stay tuned for my review of Midsommar coming in 2 weeks. It's one of my best and most ambitious videos ever, and this June I'll be doing a lot more movie reviews as well as some game reviews for the first time in 6 months, so stay tuned for all that great content coming soon.